Masechet Baba Batra Daf Kof Chaf Vav. Amarav Huna, Amarav Aseh, Bechor Shemicha, Micha. Rav Huna says in the name of Rav Aseh that if a firstborn protests, then that's a valid protest. It's not clear what Rav Aseh is talking about, and there are a couple of different ways to interpret this. I'm going to interpret this part of the sugya following Rabbeinu Hananel, not like Rashbam. Rabbeinu Hananel connects this sugya with what's coming up right after. Here, Rav Aseh also says, so I'll just read this and we'll come back to this in just a minute. If a firstborn takes a regular portion like a pashut means a non-bechor, a regular brother. If a firstborn agrees and says, let's say they're splitting up field A. There's A, B, C, D, there's a few fields, and they're dealing right now with the splitting up of field A. And the firstborn says, listen, all the produce on this field, it's okay. I give up my right, I relinquish my right to a double portion of field A. So once he does that, he relinquishes it also on other fields. We'll see exactly what this means in a second. So we're dealing with that law, that once he relinquishes part of his inheritance, so he relinquishes the rest of his inheritance also, at least for the rest of that field, maybe even for everything. That's what we're going to see in the next sugya. So here, Rav Huna says, in the name of Rav Aseh is the one that says, the next halacha says that a firstborn who protests, the protest is valid. So the case is as follows. Someone dies, he leaves to his kids field A, B, C, D. And one of them is a firstborn, the others are non-firstborns. And the firstborn says, listen, I forgo my right to a double portion in field A. But he gives the protest. I do not forgo my right on the other fields, just because for this field, I don't really care about getting a double portion. This field here is olives. I don't really like olives, so you know what? I'll just take one portion of olives. But I want you to know, because if he doesn't protest, then once he forgoes field A, then according to Rav Aseh, according to one interpretation of it we're about to see, then he forgoes also his double portion in B, C, D. So he's making a protest and he says, I'll forego field A, but I don't want to forego my double portion in B, C, and D. That's valid as long as he says so before they divvy out the inheritance from field A. That's Rav Huna's law. Amar Rabba, mistaber tamed Rav Aseh, banavim ubsarum, zetim umsakum, aval derachum la. Rabba adds that the opinion of Rav Aseh that we just learned makes sense in a case of grapes or olives that were harvested. But if they were crushed, tread on, then he does not agree. In other words, whether they're right now connected to the vines, or if you harvested them and they're no longer connected to the vines, that doesn't change them essentially. They're still olives, they're still grapes. And therefore, if the firstborn lodged a protest while divvying out field A, and he says, listen, I don't want to be I'm foregoing my right to a double portion of field A, but not for fields B, C, and D. Then, even if later on they harvest from the fields B, C, and D, his protest still stands, and he can still take a double portion. However, if in the meantime they crush the grapes, then there's a new item here. This is no longer just grapes, this is now wine. There's not olives, but now it's olive oil. Because it's a new item, so the protest that he made before doesn't count, and therefore he will not get a double portion of the olive oil and of the wine. That's the opinion of Rabbah. But Rav Yosef Amar afilu terachum. Rav Yosef says, no, it doesn't matter. Even if they tread on them, still his protest stands. And although he forwent his right to field A, but in the meantime they took off the grapes and they tread on them and they made wine, nevertheless his protest stands and he gets a double portion of the grape juice, the wine, or the olive oil. That's what Rav Yosef says. Now we ask a question against Rav Yosef. Derachum meikara inbe hashta hamra. Wait a second. If they tread on them, beforehand you had grapes, now it's wine. It's a totally new thing. So how could his protest that applied to the grapes continue and apply to the wine when it's not the same item at all? That's the question, and the answer is kedamar Rav Ukba bar Hama. Noten lo deme hezek anavav. Hachaname noten lo deme deme hezek anavav. The answer is as Rav Ukba bar Chama said in a different context. We're about to quote the original context in the next paragraph, but in that context he said, oh, of course he's not going to get a double portion of the value of the wine, because now the wine is much more valuable than grapes. So what right does he have to get a double portion in wine? Of course not, he wouldn't get that. And he didn't mean that, but rather he meant that he'll get the damages of the grapes, because the grapes are no longer here, and he did make a protest regarding grapes. So he said, I forego the whatever grows on a field A, but B, C, D, that I want a double portion. In the meantime, they went and turned them into wine. But he still deserves a double share of grapes. So the other brothers will pay him for a double share of the grapes, of the raw material, although, of course, not of the wine. And that's what he meant all along. Now let's look at the original context. What was the original context when he said that statement? ובשרים זיתים ומסקום בכור נוטל פי שניים אפילו דרחום. It was about the statement of Rav Yehuda, who said the name of Shemuel. Let's say you have a firstborn and a brother who's not a firstborn, and the father died and he left them some grapes and then they harvested them, or some olives and they harvested them. So the firstborn takes double, even though they are harvested. In the meantime, it doesn't matter, they're still grapes, they're still olives, so he gets double. And even if they tread on them, still he gets double. We asked about that. Does he really get double in the wine? Beforehand they were grapes. I understand he deserves a double portion in the grapes, but should he get a double portion in the wine? That's an enhancement that they put effort into. In the meantime, Amar Mor Ukva bar Chama liten lo deme hezek anavav. Mor Ukva bar Chama said about this statement of Shemuel, no, it doesn't mean he gets a double portion in the value of the wine, but rather a double portion in the value of the grapes. They are now damaged. There's no grapes anymore. They're all smashed. But he gets a value of the grapes and a double portion of that, and he'll get the value from whatever is left from the wine. That they'll give him that amount, the value of what the grapes would have been. Amar Avaseh. Okay, now we get the original statement of Avaseh. If a firstborn comes there, they're dividing up the inheritance, and they go part by part, and they're dealing with field A. And the firstborn says, it's okay, I don't want a double portion of this section. So then that's a relinquishment. And he doesn't get, he relinquishes also the rest. Now, my viter, what does he relinquish? Rav Papa mishemeh de Rava amar viter beota sadeh. Rav Papi mishemeh de Rava amar viter bechol nechasim kulan. We have two opinions, one by Rav Papa and one by Rav Papi. Very similar sages names, and they're both students of Rava. So maybe their teacher Rava said something, but it was a bit ambiguous, and the two students understood it differently. So the Papa says, in the name of Rava, that he only forgoes his right to that particular field. Let's say this particular field here has figs, and so the firstborn, I don't like figs so much, so they're dividing up one section of the field first. And they say, okay, you're firstborn, take double. He's like, no, it's okay, I'll just take one portion. No, it's okay. Because he forwent one portion of field A, that means he forgoes also the rest of field A, but only field A. Field B is a new thing. It's a new situation, and it didn't get to that yet. So he still gets a double portion of the next one, no matter what. Whereas, according to Rav Papi, also in the name of Rava, says once he forgoes one part, then he forgoes the entire rest of the inheritance, all of the property, right? Even though this one is figs and maybe the next one is something else and it's a separate field that they didn't talk about yet, doesn't matter. Once he says, that's okay, I don't want a double portion, just give me one, then that relinquishment applies to the entire property unless he lodges a protest and says, I forgo only this, but I still want double the rest. If he doesn't lodge a protest, then he forgoes everything according to Rav Papi. Now let's analyze their opinions. Rav Papa mishmed Rava amar viter beota sadeh. Kasavar en lo labechor kodem haluka. Uma data lideh achil. Idach laachil. Rav Papa, in the name of Rava, says that he only forgoes the rest of that particular field. If he forgoes part of it, then only field A, but B, C, D, he still gets a double portion. Why? Because he thinks that the firstborn does not have anything before they actually come to divide it. Right when the father dies, it's all in a shared estate, and at that point, the firstborn doesn't have any special connection. He doesn't acquire anything at that point, and so whatever they decide to divide, so now they're dealing with field A. Okay, so now this is right on the table, and they're deciding you get this part, you get that part, and he says, I forego. So since they're talking about field A, and since once they're talking about it, then the firstborn has a right to double, and he says, I forego. So then, even if he only forgoes part of that field, then it applies to the entirety of that field, because they're dealing with it. Only at that point does it come into his possession. But the rest of them did not yet come into his possession, and so he can't forego. You can't forego something that isn't already, that you don't have access to, that you don't have possession of. And so those fields, since they didn't deal with them, they're not yet in his possession, so he didn't forego them yet. And therefore, his foregoing only applies to field A and not the rest of it. That's according to Rav Papa. V'Rav Papi mishmed Rava amar viter bechol hanechasim kulan. Kasavar yesh lo labechor kodem haluka u'medeachil beha achil bechulehu. Rav Papi, also in the name of Rava, says that once he forgoes part of even one field, he forgoes his firstborn right to everything, all of the property, because he thinks that a firstborn has possession even before they come to divide it. As soon as the father dies, the firstborn has access to that double portion. It already belongs to him, even though it wasn't decided which particular part he would get, but he has ownership over a double portion already at that point. And therefore, since he already does have a right to it, possession of it, and he forgoes part of it, and he didn't say only part of it, so once he says, I forgo this part, it applies to the entire property. These halachot that Rav Papi and Rav Papa said in the name of Rava never actually taught this halacha explicitly. It's not like he got up in a lecture and he said, a firstborn who relinquishes part of it, he relinquishes all. And then they didn't understand, did he mean all of that section or all of the entire property? And so they had two different interpretations of what he said. That's not what happened. Rava never actually taught this halacha explicitly. Rather, these two students inferred it from a certain case that happened that came before Rava. And the case was ambiguous. And that's how they got to their two different conclusions. So what's the case? Tahu bechor. Ta'azil zabin lichsedi de ude pashut. Azu yatme bene pashut lemechal tamre manhu lakochot machunhu. You had a case of a certain firstborn. The firstborn, their father died, and they have a firstborn and an ordinary brother. And before they divided the property, the firstborn went ahead, unauthorized, and he sold his own portion and also that of his younger brother. He sold it to some purchasers. And then afterwards, the ordinary brother dies, and then the orphans of the children of the ordinary brother, they went to eat some dates from their father's land, assuming that this was their land. And then the purchasers stopped them and said, what are you doing? Started hitting them. Hey, this is our land. You kids are thieves. Get off our land. Now, they assumed that it was their land because their grandfather died and their father inherited. Then their father died, so they inherited. They figured it should be theirs, either not knowing or not accepting the sale that their uncle, the firstborn, made. Amri lehu kerobim la mistaya dizbantinuhu linichsaihu ela mimcha name mahitu lehu. So now relatives of these orphans, their kids, so the relatives are coming to their defense, and they say to the purchasers, it's not enough that you purchased this property illegally, but now also you're going to hit these kids too. So what do you mean purchased illegally? legally. So the relatives are claiming that the firstborn never had a right to sell them because it wasn't divided yet, and the firstborn can't do that. It's not his to sell. So his sale, well, if you sell something that doesn't belong to you, the sale is not valid. So you guys are not even the real purchasers. You stole it, and now you're also going to go and hit the rightful owners, these kids? That's the case. So the case came before Rava to be a judge, and he said that what the firstborn did by selling the land is nothing. The sale is not valid. These purchasers did not buy anything. They should get their money back, and the orphans of the ordinary brother, they do inherit their part, and then they should now divide the estate, and they should get their part of the land. That's what Rava said. Now, the question is, when he said the purchase was zero, did that apply to all of the purchase or only some of it? Mor Savad lo asa kelum bepalga. Rav Papi says that when Rava said that this sale is invalid, he doesn't mean the sale is totally invalid, only half of it is invalid. The half of the sale of the part that belongs to the ordinary brother, that's invalid. Because they didn't divide the estate yet, the ordinary brother didn't have yet possession of any part of it, so you couldn't possibly sell it. And however, the portion of the firstborn is already in the possession of the firstborn. So that part of the sale, that double portion of the firstborn, since even though it's not decided which part exactly will be, but nevertheless he owns it already, and therefore he has a right to sell his own part. And so that part of the sale is valid. So that goes with Rav Papi, who says that a firstborn already has the whole thing in his possession the second the father dies, even before they split it. Umor savar bechulahu, whereas Rav Papa thought that Rava meant that the entire sale is invalid, not only the portion of the ordinary brother, but even the doubled portion of the firstborn he cannot sell, because since they didn't sit down to divide it yet, it doesn't belong to him. None of it belongs to him, not even that second portion that eventually will come to him. He doesn't have possession yet before they divide it, and therefore even his own sale is invalid, and they get everything back. So that's the case. Rava just made that ruling. He never talked about this specific case. He only talked about this specific case. He didn't give a general ruling, but Rav Papa and Rav Pape inferred their rulings based on what he said in this case. Now, what's going to be the bottom line? Shalchu mitam bechol shemachar kodem chaluka lo asa kelum. From Eretz Yisrael, they sent a ruling that if a firstborn sells before the division, he has done nothing. So that would follow Rav Papa. Alma en lo labechor kodem chaluka. You see, since he can't even sell his own part of it before the division. So you see that a firstborn does not have possession before they divide it. So that's like Rav Papa. V'ilcheta yesh labechor kodem chaluka. However, the Gemara itself says no, the halacha is not like that, but rather like Rav Papi, that a firstborn does have possession even before the division. And now a last story, Mor Zutra. Mid Rishba, Pelag besana de pilpele behade achin beshave. Mor Zutra from Rishba, the house of Rishba. He was a firstborn. He divided a basket of peppers from the estate of his fathers with his brothers, and he said, I don't really like peppers. It's okay. I don't want a double portion. You guys just give me an equal portion. So he only did that for one basket of peppers, but there's the rest of the inheritance. Now what about that? So he came to Rav Asher, and the brothers are saying, oh, look, see, he relinquished his right to all of the property because he didn't want the peppers. Now he doesn't get a double portion for anything else. But Mor Zutra says, no, I didn't mean that. I just don't like peppers. Of course I wanted the double portion of the other things in the fields. Amar lehoil vitarta b'miksat vitarta bechol nechasin kulan. And Rav Asher ruled that since you relinquished your right to part of it, you relinquished your right to all of it. In other words, he followed halacha l'maaseh like Rav Papi, that a firstborn does already have a right to all of his double possession, and therefore if he relinquishes even just part of it, then that's automatically a relinquishment of the entire double portion of the entire estate, but he still gets the single portion of it. And now the next Mishnah HaOmer, Ish peloni beni bechor lo yitol pi shenayim. Ish peloni beni lo yirash im ehav. Lo amar kelum. Sheitna al ma shekatub batorah. If someone, before he dies, a father says, this person is my firstborn, he should not get double. I don't want my firstborn to get double. That's my will. I want him to get just a regular portion with his brothers. Or if that father before he dies, he says, this person, my son, I don't want him to get any portion at all. I disinherit this son from my estate. He should get zero inheritance. In either of these cases, it's as if he said nothing. We ignore that statement because he made a condition that is against the Torah. The Torah says all sons get an equal portion and the firstborn gets a double portion. And you cannot go against the Torah. You cannot make a condition, even though it's a financial thing, against the stipulations, the laws of the Torah. Now, המחלק נכסיו על פיו, ריבה לאחד ומיית לאחד, והשווה להן את הבכור, דבריו קיימין, ואם אמר משום ירושה, לא אמר כלום. כתב בין בתחילה, בין באמצע, בין בסוף, משום מתנה, דבריו קיימין. Now, if someone is on his deathbed and he's giving out this property as a gift is totally different from an inheritance. A gift, so I can give a gift to anybody I want. I could give all of my property to some friend, some cousin, anyone I want. While the person is alive, he can do that. And so, if he says, I want to give a gift and I want to give this son more than the other son, or I want to give all of them equal and including the firstborn, he should get an equal gift with everybody else. I want to give all my kids $10,000 equally, so then he can do that. Now, if he said, I'm going to bequeath it as an inheritance, then he has said nothing. That's the first case over here. Now, if he writes it down in a will, if he wrote down, whether at the beginning of the will, or in the middle, or at the end, that this is a gift, then the statement stands. As long as somewhere in the will he said the word that this is a gift, that's okay. But if he didn't say it's a gift, instead he said it's an inheritance, then it's no good. So that's the basic principle. If it's a gift, then you can give anyone anything, but if it's inheritance, then you have to follow the Torah laws. Gemara. Lema matnitin dela Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda hamar bedavar shel mamon tenao kayam. It seems that this Mishnah is not according to Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda has a principle that when it comes to monetary matters, any condition stands. Even though the standard rule is that this person gets this amount, but if they both agree and say, no, I don't want to get that amount, then that's okay. You can always make a stipulation between two people. And here's the example. Detanya, ha'omer li shahareat mikudeshet li almenat she'en lich alai she'er kesut ve'ona harezo mikudeshet u'tena'o batel. Dibir Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda omer b'davar shel mamon tena'o kayam. If someone is getting married and he says to his bride, hareat mikudeshet li, you are betrothed unto me on condition that I have no responsibility for your food, clothing, and conjugal rights. Normally, this is embedded. This is in the Torah. Torah says that this is an obligation upon all husbands to provide for their wives these three items, and it's included in the ketubah also. But this guy says, listen, I want to marry you, but I don't want to pay for your stuff. Is that valid? So the answer is they are married, but according to the Meir, we ignore the condition, and he has to pay for her food, her clothing, her shelter. Some say, oh, not his cosmetics. Others say his conjugal rights. He has to do it anyway, because according to the Meir, he made a condition against the Torah, and he has no right to do that. However, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, this is a monetary thing, and therefore the condition is valid. So you see, according to Rabbi Yehuda, even though it goes against the Torah, if you make a condition, then it's a monetary amount, then it's valid. So it seems that Rabbi Yehuda would also say, in the case of an inheritance, that if the father says, I want all my sons to get equally, including the firstborn, or if he says, I want this son to get nothing. Well, it's a monetary matter, so even though it goes against the Torah, it should be valid. So therefore, this Mishnah would not be in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda. Is that right? And the answer is no. Afilu tema de Yehuda. Hatam yada'a v'kamachla. Hacha la kamachil. You could say that our Mishnah is according to the Yehuda as well, because in the case of a man getting married to a woman, she knows the condition and she accepts it anyway. So that means she waives her right. When the man says, on condition that I'm not going to give you any food and clothing and shelter and so on, now, it's her choice to accept the ring or to say, forget it, I'm not accepting it. You can't do Kiddushin by force. The woman has to agree. She heard the condition. She understood it. She says, that's okay. I'll handle myself. And she agreed to it anyway. Therefore, the condition is valid. However, this son who was disinherited, or the firstborn son who lost his double right, did he waive his right? He did not. We presume that no son would waive his right. He would protest. He'd say, what do you mean, Dad? Right? I want to get my share, my rightful share as well. And maybe he's not even there to waive his right. So the son does not waive his right, and therefore even a Yehuda will make a distinction between a woman who waives the right and a son who does not waive his right, and therefore, in the case of inheritance, the condition is not valid, even according to the Yehuda. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Ish peloni beni bechori hu notel pi shenayim. Ish peloni bechor hu eno notel pi shenayim. Dilma buchra de'ima kamar. And the next few cases we're going to be dealing with is, how do you know if someone is a bechor? They don't have a lot of medical records back then, and so you have to need testimony that this particular brother is the firstborn. So Rav Yosef says, if someone says this person is my firstborn son, he said that while he was alive, then that person gets a double portion. We believe him because the father said, this is my firstborn. Good. However, if he says this person is a firstborn, then he does not get a double portion, because maybe that means that he is a firstborn from the mother, but not his firstborn. He might have a firstborn from a first wife, and now this is a firstborn from a second wife, meaning it's her first child, but not his. And a firstborn of a mother doesn't get double, only the firstborn of the father. And so since he didn't say my firstborn, just a firstborn, so that's not enough of a proof that it's in fact his firstborn. And that was story. Hoda atala kamed Rabba bar Hana. Amar le muchzekani beze shehu bechor. A case that a certain person, a witness, came to Rabba bar Hana and he says, muchzakni, I have a chazakah, I know that this person is a firstborn. We presume that he came also with another witness. You need two witnesses to testify that someone is a firstborn, because taking money away essentially from the other brothers and giving it to this person to give him the double. Amar le minayadat. So Rabba bar Hana, he doesn't just accept what the witnesses say automatically. He wants to interrogate them. He says, how do you know that this particular person is the firstborn? Tavakari le abu bukhra sichla, because I heard his father, before he died, the father called this kid foolish firstborn. So that means he's firstborn. Dilma bukhra deimahu. Techol bukhra deima name bukhra sichla karule. But Rabba bar Hana did not accept it, because he said maybe it's only a firstborn to the mother, because indeed people would call the firstborn to a mother foolish firstborn. Why would they call them foolish? Because the child is a firstborn, technically from the mother, but doesn't get any of the benefits of being firstborn, of getting a double portion. So yeah, you're firstborn, but too bad your mother married someone who already had a child beforehand, and therefore you're firstborn, but without any of the benefits, without the rights of a double portion, and that's why it's called a foolish firstborn. So actually, just because his father called the kid foolish firstborn doesn't mean he's the firstborn from the father. It's more likely he meant firstborn from the mother. And sorry, don't get double portion. Hahuda talekamed Rabbi Hanina amale muchzakni beze shehu bechor. Similar case of someone that came to Rabbi Hanina, a witness, together with another witness, and said, we know that this person is a firstborn. He should get double. After the father dies, they come and testify. Amar le minayadat. So Rabbi Hanina is going to interrogate them. How do you know? how? Amar le'tichi havu atu legabe avu, amar lehu zilu legabe shichat beri, tebuchrahu umaseruke. Because this father who died, he was an eye doctor. And when people would come to him with some eye ailment, in those days they believed that saliva, you put it in someone's eye, it was an ailment, and this has a healing property. However, not just any saliva from anyone, only that of a firstborn. So the father, the eye doctor, said to his patients, go to Shichat, my son, because he is a firstborn, and his saliva, tell him to spit in your eye, and that will be better. So you see, he called this son, Shichat was his name, he called him firstborn, so therefore it must be that he is the firstborn. Now we ask, hold on, V'dilma buchra di'imahu, maybe he's only the firstborn of the mother, but not of the father, and therefore does not deserve a double portion. Gemiri buchra da'aba, maseruke, buchra di'ima, la maseruke. No, that cannot be, because we learned, this is in the old medical textbooks, that only the firstborn of a father, that person's saliva can heal an eye ailment, but if someone's a firstborn only from the mother, then their spit does not heal an eye ailment. So therefore, we presume that the father, who's this doctor, knows this, and when he said, this is my son who's a firstborn, then it must be also a firstborn of the father, and therefore does get the double portion. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.